Hello everyone, you are listening to the HP Leader podcast. My name is Rachel Moses and I'm delighted to host this brilliant podcast series, even if I do say so myself, talking about breaking disability barriers. And this particular podcast series is on reasonable adjustments. What do they mean? How can we achieve them? Some of the challenges we have, and also the role of leadership in this. So I'm delighted today to be joined by a fabulous panel, all-female panel. It wasn't deliberate. We did have the wonderful Mike joining us, but unfortunately he's had to drop out due to internet difficulties. So I'd just like everyone to introduce themselves. Starting with you, please, Carrie.
Hi there, my name's Carrie. I'm a physiotherapist and a guide dog owner.
Thanks, Carrie. Cheryl.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Gascoigne. I'm a paediatric occupational therapist half of the week, and I am a lecturer practitioner for the other half of the week. And I've had a kidney transplant.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks for joining us again. Raz.
Hi, I'm Raz, and I'm a dietitian and I'm a wheelchair user.
Now, I'm sure you all recognise the wonderful panel from the previous podcast, and it was actually Cheryl's idea, this whole concept of reasonable adjustments, which, you know, I really liked, and particularly as a manager, having been through attempts to achieve reasonable adjustments for staff under my care. And slight disclaimer here, Raz and I do work with each other. And we're currently going through some of these challenges together from a manager-employee perspective. So just to get that out there from the start. And another slight disclaimer is when everyone is speaking on the panel, and this is myself included from a management perspective, and some of the challenges that I've had on behalf of my employees and colleagues, is we may not be referencing the organisation we work for at this moment in time. And this isn't about finger pointing, this isn't about blame, this is about actually these are lived experiences that people have went through, and these are challenges that people have, and it's identifying that the system is far from perfect, even when we all work in healthcare. So this is about really an opportunity to understand what people do go through, what challenges they have, the impact it can have, but also how we can be more supportive and help strive for more inclusivity in the workplace. So that's the reason why. Now I'm just going to start by the government definition, if you like, with reference to the Equality Act, of what a reasonable adjustment is for workers with disabilities or health conditions. An employer by law must make reasonable adjustments to make sure workers with disabilities or physical or mental health conditions are not substantially disadvantaged when doing their jobs. This applies to all workers, including trainees, apprentices, students, contract workers, and business partners. And reasonable adjustments can include anything from the recruitment process, so making changes to the recruitment process so a candidate can be considered for a job that they may not be able to perform without reasonable adjustments. Doing things in other ways, such as allowing someone with social anxiety disorder to have their own desk instead of hot desking to make reasonable adjustments, making physical changes to the workplace that might not already exist to make it more accessible. And there might be specific equipment requirements, or allowing people to start a job with a phased approach, phased return, or with reasonable hours adjustment. For example, starting out as a conventional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday roles. So that all seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? In 2020, in a world where equality, inclusivity, and diversity has never been so important, that when you read it, seems quite simple, but in reality, it's far from that, isn't it? Now, what I want to do is just go around the panel and ask people what a reasonable adjustment means to them. Living with a disability, what does it mean to you as an individual? And Cheryl, if I can start with you, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So a reasonable adjustment for me has actually been the difference between remaining a full-time member of staff and not, to be honest. So I guess if I go back historically, before I worked in healthcare very quickly, I was really quite poorly when I worked. I was a civil servant, And I left that job. I was asked to leave because I couldn't fulfill my role because of health needs. And when I look back at that now, I just think that wasn't accommodated at all my difficulties. When I moved into the NHS, I was so supported. And if I'm honest, I am still so supported. Reasonable adjustments have, like I say, were there from the moment I was interviewed. I openly admitted and discussed my difficulties at interview. I wasn't asked to, but for me, I'm an open book. I wanted people to know what my difficulties and challenges are. And so from the very beginning, and also when I got the job in 2015, and I was told I needed a kidney transplant within weeks. So as the clock was ticking, things got progressively worse quite quickly. So for me, reasonable adjustments were all about flexible starting times, flexible finishing times, and it was never about a shorter week. My manager would openly admit that I always did over and above, but it was more peace of mind knowing that if I was having a really tricky day, that I could come in at 9:30 and miss the traffic and, you know, go over the Tyne Bridge where I live. It can take an hour to get across, but in fact I could just jump in the car at like 9:30 instead, driving to work. And it was more, like I say, the peace of mind than the actual time spent sitting at home that hour. So that was a massive one for me. It was things as well, like at lunchtime before my transplant, I used to be so tired I'd sometimes go to the car and sit and have a sleep. Now I'm sure if some people were found sitting in the car at lunchtime having a snoozy, they might think otherwise of, you know, what's going on. But for me, again, it was just I was exhausted. I mean, I was so tired. But post-transplant, I still need reasonable adjustments. There's no doubt about it. My medication causes difficulties for us. So again, I have flexible starting times and finishing times and different bits and pieces. And if I'm honest with you, reasonable adjustments have never been a challenge. What is a challenge and remains a challenge are other members of staff's interpretation of a reasonable adjustment, and why can you start early, and well, why does you do, you know, and it's that, and I feel it's that persistent justification of this is why. And I don't mind sharing, but a lot of people don't want to do that, and actually I don't feel like I should have to.
I think you've raised such an important point early on that a lot of people just won't even register when we're talking about reasonable adjustments. So thank you for that, Cheryl. And we're definitely going to come back to that once we've heard from Raz and Carrie. Raz, can I move on to you, please?
Yeah, so I think what a reasonable adjustment means to me is essentially levelling the playing field. I think disabled people generally have it quite difficult within society, and that was mirrored by David Isaac, who was the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission for 4 years. One of the things he came out saying after stepping down from his role is how the biggest thing he's learnt in 4 years of chairing the Equality and Human Rights Commission is how disabled people in this country are treated like second-class citizens. So for me, reasonable adjustments are really important so that I don't feel that way in my workplace. For me, it's a little bit maybe different from Cheryl in perspectives of being a wheelchair user. So I have a lot of physical barriers, both kind of getting to work, which I know we touched on previously. So flexible working is also something which is really important for me when someone's forgot to put a ramp down, or I can't get on a bus because the ramp's not working. And also I think other things such as making sure there are accessible changing rooms so I can get dressed into scrubs easier, that PPE is reachable for me, things like having a laptop to type so it's less fatiguing, and many, many more. Just equal access even to an office. There are so many dietetic departments which are not wheelchair accessible. So for me, it's more of a physical barrier type thing.
Thank you, Raz. Carrie.
Okay. So reasonable adjustment for me, obviously having Amber, my guide dog, I would say part of reasonable adjustment for me is her being able to be with me, which I don't think really should be considered as a reasonable adjustment. I think having your mobility aid with you should just happen anyway. But unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. And yeah, there's been various occasions I've been asked to leave her somewhere, start work without her. I was asked to start my first job without her, which was quite disappointing when you're, looking forward to your first job, being qualified. But like Raz says, I think it's about that level playing field, and it's about not feeling disadvantaged. And I know for me as a guide dog owner, like I would get half an hour for lunch. And in that time, I would have to take Amber out of the hospital and off of the grounds for her to find somewhere for her to go to the toilet, during my lunch break, to then try and get my lunch, to then come back to work again. And trying to squeeze that into that time was quite difficult. So yeah, I think reasonable adjustment, and like Cheryl said, fatigue is a major factor as well, and it's about giving you that time and, you know, potentially those flexible working hours and things for you to actually to do all the things outside of your job as well, like being a mum, like, you know, actually having a life outside of work, not being so tired that when you get home you need to sleep for 2 hours because you can't physically function to cook tea for your kids. Like, to me, that's not an acceptable level of fatigue for people to expect you to work at. Yeah, so that would be my reasonable adjustments, really, I think.
Thank you. And it's also about quality of life, isn't it? And it's their work-life balance when people are so driven to work. And I mean, one of the reasons why all three of you are here is because you're so passionate about being an EHP, you're so passionate about the NHS and healthcare and how you want to be as independent as possible. And that's what a reasonable adjustment is, isn't it? It's allowing you to be as independent as possible and to perform within the best of your abilities as anybody else has the ability to do. Now, one of the things I want to touch on is whose responsibility is it? So if I put myself in the manager zone now, if I was to recruit someone who identified as having a disability on their recruitment form, I would then need to approach that person before they joined the organisation to find out what their reasonable adjustments are. Now, one of the challenges as a manager for doing that is sometimes that person doesn't know what their reasonable adjustment is until they're physically started in the organisation, but yet the organisation makes you detail it. And Raz, I don't know whether to come to you first, because again, having the disclaimer that we work together, but before you joined the organisation, you know, you were asked to detail what physical adaptations were needed to a workplace that you'd never physically been into because you weren't an employee. So from your perspective, Raz, whose responsibility is it to provide the reasonable adjustment?
So I definitely think it's the employer's responsibility, and I think a caveat to the Equality Act, which often isn't spoken about, is the fact that the Equality Act is actually anticipatory. So what that means is that the organisation should already be anticipating what would happen if different disabilities come through their doors and what they would do. But I think in practice, the reality of that happening is quite small. So I think that's kind of why I also wanted to be in this podcast. It's that if there are any managers listening, I think it would be really great if we could start getting things like mindsets like that into place. And I actually personally think a gold standard would be an organisation thinking about different disabilities, so things like visual impairment, hearing impairment, chronic illnesses, physical disabilities in advance already about what they can offer and what they need to change. But I think at the moment this isn't happening. So I definitely think it's the employer's duty, but I also do think, I think Cheryl, you were touching on this, I think it's everyone's responsibility to be mindful of reasonable adjustments. I don't think reasonable adjustments are ever taught in like school or university or what it is. I think people often get questioned about them as well, and it can make people feel quite uncomfortable, like, oh, why are you leaving early and things like that. And exactly like you were saying, Cheryl, people shouldn't need to justify themselves to someone else. So whilst it is the employer's duty for me to put in like physical, like to take away the physical barriers, I do think it's everyone's duty to be mindful that people might have illnesses that people can't see, or reasonable adjustments which might be in place, and just maybe not to question them.
Absolutely, and I think you've linked that in really nicely to Cheryl there, because some of the, again, from a management perspective, some of the disclosures people have made to me in terms of their hidden disabilities and just not wanting people to necessarily know, not because they're either ashamed or because they don't want to speak openly, it's because it's very personal to them. It's a very personal thing and people don't want to be defined by it. So then I think Cheryl, you know, then people not understanding why it might be acceptable for you to have a Susan car, you know, when there might be misconceptions that come with someone having a Susan their car. So can I come over to you for comments from your perspective in terms of whose responsibility is it? And like Raz said, that connection between everyone's responsibility to be aware.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't had any negative experiences as an employee with regards to reasonable adjustments. If I'm honest, it was a collaborated approach. So my manager would say to me, where are you struggling? And what is it that we can do to help? So it was basically, I would describe the things that I was finding challenging, and then we would collaboratively come up with a variety of things that we could try. So it was things like, if necessary, a reduced workload, maybe do all of your visits in the morning so that you can just be in the office, or work from home in the afternoon. And it was tailored, it was very bespoke, and it worked really well. I think what I need to say on the back of that is, a couple of weeks ago, I've been involved with, obviously in the last podcast, I was saying that I'm the chair of the Disability Staff Network. Our trust was doing a major recruitment in response to COVID, and as part of the interview process, I was there in my capacity as the Disability Staff Network chair, and I was able to speak to each person who disclosed that they had a disability, and just in private, have a couple of minutes talk and ask explain what the day looked like, what the tests were going to be like, and while they didn't need to tell me what their disability was, what is it that we could do, given they were given a bit of an insight as to the tests they were going to have, and what is it that we could do to make them have as positive of an opportunity, and exactly what everybody's mentioned, that level playing field. And it was so well received. I was so uplifted having the feedback that we got from that.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I love how the Geordie comes out in you as well as you talk more.
Oh, and it gets faster.
Carrie.
Yeah, so I'm with Raz, like, in, I think it's the employer's responsibility, but like Cheryl says, I think it's about being able to have that discussion. And I think when you have a disability, to actually sit down with your potential employer and talk about all the things that you might find difficult, it can make you feel very, very vulnerable. And I think you need some sort of reassurance or some rapport built, so you actually know that it's almost like safe for you to be able to have those discussions, and that you're not being judged, and you're not, they're not already thinking, oh God, she's going to be a nightmare. They're on board with that, trying to help you process. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, one of the things we wanted to talk about was lived experience of reasonable adjustments, and I've actually coined it as the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're moving on to that a little bit. Now, I do have some statements from people who have reached out after the last set of podcast series to give some lived experience of how they felt. And Carrie, I think you've just touched on there a little bit. So one thing, someone reached out and said, having a visible disability means I'm already disadvantaged because people already have the notion in their head that I am just going to be trouble, and I am going to make other people's lives more difficult because I do need reasonable adjustments. So when you constantly live in that space, you then maybe don't declare other reasonable adjustments that might be made as you go through your employment journey, because you already feel a burden to the organisation. You also feel a burden to your team, because again, you never really know if they feel disadvantaged because you're part of it, and that can be really soul destroying as time goes on. Then when you maybe need a reasonable adjustment that isn't included initially, then you feel like you're getting special treatment, but actually it's just about leveling the playing field, like Raz says. Thanks for mentioning that again. So that absolutely broke my heart when I got that, and I was like, this is one of the reasons we're having this conversation. So with that in mind, I replied back and said, how have you approached the situation? And that it's all, sometimes they don't know whether approaching it in a really sensitive manner is the right way, like saying, oh, would it be possible if we could consider this, rather than saying, as part of the law, it is my legal right to have this at work. And they said they hadn't really got the right balance yet, and felt that either way they've approached it, they've always been made to feel like that. So one of the things I wanted to ask you as the panel is, in terms of these ugly experiences that people have, is anyone else experienced that, for number one? Is that been a challenge and a barrier? And maybe for people listening to that, can they relate to it? Raz, I can see you nodding your head there. Do you want to start off?
Yeah, so I think from many different forums I've spoken, and I don't think it's a secret that I've had quite a challenging time from my days. Lectures were placed where there was no step-free access, so I physically couldn't get there. And I think although it's potentially lessened in employment, there are still so many barriers. I think exactly kind of what that person was saying is that it can make you feel really small. And I think the difficulty is that exactly like they were saying, you don't want to raise so many things and also raise them multiple times as well. I think that's something which is really challenging. If you've asked once, you don't want to keep being like, oh, I'm really struggling, just because of the way I guess that could be perceived. I think it's really important that you do work somewhere where you are comfortable. And I think that's one of the most important things. And I will mention on that note that because of some previous experiences that I have had, I know that Access to Work have offered me in new employments the ability for them to come in and do a talk with HR and managers about disability generally. So just in case anyone is kind of struggling with that, that is actually something Access to Work can come in and do, and that can maybe potentially help to set the scene if you've struggled previously. So I think a lot of people also don't know how to react to reasonable adjustments, especially in my case where there's typically a third party involved. So it's not like someone like my manager can build a step-free access bin or build an accessible changing room. And so I think when multiple parties are involved, that's also where it can become quite difficult, because it's not something where everyone can just be very hands-on and change it like that. I think going forward as well, something I didn't do initially is use all the resources out there. So I think I didn't raise things early enough, and then by the time I raised them, so many things had built up that I got so stressed and I was so deflated that it had got to such a state that it was quite, in some ways, irreversible. And I wish that I had spoken to people in my situation, other colleagues. I wish I'd spoken to the trade union. I wish I'd spoken to HR, who were actually very helpful at that time. I've actually had pretty positive experiences, but I just didn't reach out early enough. So yeah, that's what I would say. Use the different resources as well around you. And hopefully someone might be able to help with that.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to the impact of COVID, because certainly with Access to Work, that's been a bigger impact, and also about reasonable adjustments rather than a reasonable adjustment. And I think there's a difference there, isn't there? It's about it being a continual adjustment rather than being a one-off to either tick the box or say that it's been done or it's been addressed. Carrie, can I come into you before coming over to Cheryl, please?
Yeah, so I think I agree with you, Rachel. Like I think it should be an organic process. Like it should evolve reasonable adjustments as our career evolves, and as we evolve as clinicians, we should, that should come with it. And the challenges, they'll change, they'll naturally change. And I think that's what I noticed with doing my core rotations for the first 2 years. With Amber, obviously we rotated every 4 months. So every 4 months we had somewhere like a different set of things to get used to, different place to memorize, and just like silly little things like memorizing where the soap was on a ward or where the gloves are, and that kind of thing. And that can really take its toll. And I know when I was first recruited, my trust, they were so keen to get everything right, that I ended up in a meeting with 10 different people of like the sort of the bigwigs, if you like, because they'd never had a guide dog in the trust and they wanted to get it right and they were worried about it. But then by actually bringing just me on my own into that meeting, when I'd never actually done a physio job with my guide dog, it turned incredibly intimidating, and it didn't set out what it was supposed to do, I think. So I think from a like management perspective, I think it's to always be aware as well, like we said, you do feel vulnerable talking about your disability and disclosing that. And, if you've got to do it in a room, with the chief exec and another 9 strangers that you've never met before, you don't feel great about it.
Again, I don't think the impact of that's maybe necessarily thought through, is it? I don't think that it's genuinely people coming from a good place, but probably definitely not thinking about the impact of the individual, and that it's that constant lived experience, the constant having to relive everything, the constant realization as someone reached out and said that you're not normal, that you don't fit that normal. And that again was a phrase that really touched me, and thought, well, what defines normal anyway? Like what is normal? But that's how they were made to feel, by the constant need to have something additional to what the able-bodied person would have in reference to this comment. And that really got me thinking of, do we understand the impact of that? And Cheryl, maybe this is something from a network perspective as well that helps, by having a good network or having colleagues around you that fully understand. I know you said from an employee perspective you felt that you've always been supported. Do you want to come in on any of those angles?
Yeah, all of them. So with regards to the network, I mean, we all try really hard to support and understand each other. And there's people within our network, we have no idea what their disability is. They just obviously identify as having a disability. And it can actually be quite challenging at times to try and support one another. But in truth, it's just a nice group where you can openly say, I'm having a really tough time, and maybe discuss some of the challenges that you're having. And more often than not, sadly, somebody else within that network's had a very similar experience. And so you just learn from their experiences as well. And that's not necessarily good, because, it means we're all having negative experiences. But to put a different spin on it, sometimes it's positive. It's not always negative. So yeah, I mean, it's a real pleasure, and I think I'm quite humbled to be able to receive messages from people and offer them support. But I think what I have to be very mindful of is anybody within the trust could be the chair of the Disability Staff Network. I'm just really fortunate that I'm an OT, and my job very much focuses on independence, meaningful occupation, all of those things, being active, function. And so I almost switch to therapist sometimes, and I've got to be really mindful of not doing that. But I guess it's a toolbox I can tap into.
So one of the things that jumped out of my mind when we talk about reasonable adjustments, an adjustment was, again, I hope you don't mind Raz making a particular reference to something that we're going through, which was foot pedal bins. And someone said to me in the States, oh, well, we can just get her a bin. And I said, what do you mean? They said, oh, we can just get her a special bin. And I said, she works on intensive care, she works on the wards, she goes to the kitchens. I was like, this girl is all over the hospital, and she obviously uses a bathroom as well. So it was almost like just that total lack of insight that it was reasonable adjustments, that it wasn't just about a one-off. So Raz, I don't know if you want to come in there, but for me, it's about addressing the whole systemic challenge rather than one specific challenge that you had to identify yourself because you've been forced to identify because someone needs to know what they need to do.
Yeah, and I think it is quite challenging though, and I think this is the thing. And the other thing to mention about reasonable adjustments is they're objective as well. So an employer can actually decline a reasonable adjustment if it's not practical or the cost involved is too much. And this is the conversation I was trying to explain to estates about how we can't just switch all our bins to sensor bins because the cost, practicality, the upkeep, it's just not a practical thing. And bless them, they were trying their best to, I think, just think what they can do. And I think that's because they really want to help. And sometimes in these situations, I do actually think it's good to sometimes get, and I know trusts don't like doing this, but someone external who's actually trained in kind of disability within a state. So I think that can be quite helpful as well. I think we are awaiting an Equality Act survey where we are at the moment as well, and hopefully that will bring some findings as well. But I think it is quite challenging because people want to help, but they can't help, I guess, what they don't know as well. And sometimes it is about being like, okay, we're not going to say anything for now, but we're just going to go and research it and then come back to you, because some of the ideas, although well-intentioned and have good meaning, are not always the best as well. And again, it just sometimes makes you feel a bit small, because you just feel like you're kicking up a fuss, and that's like the last thing I'd really want to do. But then I think probably for all of us, we think about, well, there's going to be someone behind us coming up. So I think that's also why it's important to change it as well.
Yeah, and it's not only about you. I know you're a big believer and supporter of this, Raz, but in one of my previous organisations, my trust was so inaccessible for patients. And when we eventually employed, and it was on voluntary employment as well, so non-paid employment, but they were contracted, and they were a wheelchair user, it was completely inaccessible. And it's about not just doing right for colleagues and employees, it's about the patients, because if members of staff have difficulty accessing, now that includes visual limitations, guide dog users, visual disabilities. So it's a whole spectrum, and it's even the way someone was explaining to me once, a guide dog user who was a patient, it's even just having a reception area that's accessible, but then free of noise, and a contact where, you can then say, can you tell me how to get to X? Or someone saying, do you need any assistance? It's just asking the question, and then you say yes or no, rather than having to kind of hunt someone out. And it's about making the whole environment more inclusive to everyone. And that's probably the thing for me, the more I've tried to learn, it almost seems like an impossible task. So do you want to come in there, Raz?
Yeah, I was going to say, and that's the thing about the accessible changing room, which I find quite upsetting, to be honest, is that I know obviously since COVID things have changed, but before that we would have so many wheelchair users coming into the hospital, coming in for outpatient appointments, and it's likely that they were probably thinking about what they're drinking and trying to dehydrate themselves because there isn't that accessible changing room, so that if they wanted to get dressed, if they had an accident or something, that they could, and that's not there. And it's not just for me, it's for our patients as well.
Oh, absolutely. And those, children, young adults with neuro disabilities having to get changed on floors, and it's the whole Changing Places campaign. I'm very lucky because one of my previous patients, Zach, lobbied for this for the motorways and saved all these millions. But I was completely ignorant until I used to be involved in his care, and he used to educate me on this. And doesn't that say something as a clinician that works in that field? So I hold my hands up and say there's a lot of ignorance around this as well, because if it doesn't affect you, you feel like it's not your responsibility. And living without a disability, I think I've, from a management perspective, been on this journey. So COVID has affected so many things on so many levels. And I mentioned about the access to work, Raz, that COVID can't do on-site assessments. Because of COVID, it can't do on-site assessments. So that's really put an additional level of kind of inequality into the mix. Now, Cheryl, I wanted to come to you as well in terms of your perception of COVID and shielded workers, for example. I've done a whole podcast on shielded workers and the impact that maybe colleagues not understanding the impact of being shielded, having to shield, being told all of a sudden they're a clinician, that can't come to work anymore, or people who actually are taking responsibility for their own healthcare needs to say, it's not safe for me to come in because of X, Y, and Z, and constantly having to feel like they need to justify themselves.
Yeah, all of the above. I could still cry just thinking about it. So the way I've described my last, we're 9 months now. I would say I've lived at work. I've worked from home and I'm living at work as far as I'm concerned. Again, I can't lie. I have felt fully supported managerially. Is that right? Managerially to remain at home, and I've been fully supported, but I don't feel understood. I had a couple of weeks in between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2. You know, that it was like August time. I went into work, and I had a couple of conversations with different people from different parts of the organisation that really opened my eyes and, to be honest, broke me a little bit. And some of the conversations were things like, why did I shield? I openly and honestly talk about quite a lot my disability, because no offense to anybody who says this, but I struggle with the term hidden disability, because people often say, oh, but what's wrong? We can't say anything. And I don't say I've got hidden disability, because to me, hidden almost sounds like I'm embarrassed and ashamed of it and I'm hiding it away. There is visible aspects to my disability, but people don't necessarily see that I've got a disability. So I choose to share that because I obviously struggle. My mobility is not good, etc., etc. Anyway, this colleague said to me, so why did you shield? Surely you miss coming into work. And I just said, I've received a kidney from someone who was an altruistic donor, chose to give their kidney for no other reason than the goodness of their heart, to give to me. I was in what was called a paid exchange. To cut a long story short, my husband wanted to donate to me and couldn't, because I had antibodies against him. So he gave one to a stranger, and I received one from a stranger. And I feel like I owe not just my health, not just to my 4 children and my grandchildren, but to the people who've given these huge decisions to give away part of their body for my well-being. And so I don't just stay home for my health; it's for the health and the maintenance of everybody within that whole cycle of my organ transplant journey. But to be asked why I chose to shield, but it blows my mind, because it's actually nobody's business. I've shared the fact that I'm a kidney transplant patient, and that's fine. But then I was asked another question, and that is like, I didn't realise that you weren't so resilient, Cheryl. There's other members of staff who are shielding, are clinically vulnerable, and they're coming in. I don't care, actually. I don't care. If somebody has got a disability or are clinically extremely vulnerable and chooses to come to work, it might be that work is where they've got their social support network, they've got nobody else at home, and they choose to come in. I respect their decision as much as I think my decision should be respected as well. But still now I feel, I have to email my colleagues, and again, nobody ever says anything. It's my sense of like dread. I haven't seen a patient in 9 months. Can someone go out and see this child? Can someone go out and do this? It's absolutely soul destroying. It's not why I worked in, all those years to qualify as an OT. I love my job and I think the world of my colleagues, but I feel a bit broken with COVID. I feel broken, and I feel a little bit forgotten about. One other quick example, and it's stupid, I know, but for 4 months, me, my husband, and my 2 youngest children who are still at home stayed in that whole time. We properly shielded, that we didn't break any rules, and we probably took it to the extreme. And I heard nothing from any of my colleagues. I got a gift through the post. I got an Easter egg from the trust, and I got a gift through the post after having a meeting with our chief exec. It was like hand care that other people had received, and it must have been a case like, oh, we'll send one out. So I got one. That was lovely. Then I went back to work for a few weeks in between the 2 lockdowns, and one of my colleagues went into isolation for a fortnight, and people were panicking. How's she managing? We'll ring her, we'll email her. And I just was like, wowza, just had 4 months of that. Just it's the inequality, and it's your own mindset, isn't it? And how it makes the whole process, how it makes you feel.
Oh, you're bringing back so many memories from the Shielded podcast, and that's how people found Cheryl. And
hard.
In the first lockdown, in the height of the pandemic, I think the shielded workers were massively neglected. And I think as we're community workers as well, I think the whole focus was on the front line and acute care, and even my colleagues in MSK and outpatients, and those colleagues keeping people out of hospital. But what that probably shows, Cheryl, it goes back to your previous comments about not really understanding and not really therefore having the recognition of the impact of that. Now, I cannot think of anything more horrific than having to shield in my house for 4 months. And from someone who I'm at home today in Newcastle, obviously work away from home, the thought of spending even 5 days, Cheryl, working from home, people are like, working from home isn't amazing. I would be like you. No, because you end up living at your work. I find that people that shielded felt like they had to prove extra, they had to do extra, they had to be extra, and they never had that turn-off time. Like you said, Cheryl, I actually found that there was people who were classed as clinically vulnerable but made the decision to come into work because they felt they could do their 9 to 5, go home and be completely protective in either a COVID secure or even in a COVID area. You're in full PPE, you have good protection, and it was their individual choice. So it's actually spending time talking to the individual, saying, okay, you have this long-term health condition, you have this disability, however it's defined by the individual, saying what works for you, what feels safe for you. Let's facilitate that so you feel you're still contributing but have a work-life balance, that we're looking after your health and well-being, and that you feel like you're a valued member of our organisation and our team. I think if managers are listening and we're in the second lockdown, I know there's a big hoo-ha because London's going into second lockdown. Newcastle's never been out of it. Liverpool's never been out of it. But, because London are going into it again, I think there's, but just really think about yourself as a manager and think about, do you understand what that person's not only going through, but continues to go through? And where, like you said, where's your role in that, Cheryl? Because sometimes it can be that single email, can't it? Thanks for everything you're doing. We value you. How are you doing? What can I do to help? That's sometimes all you need, even if the answer is nothing. I'm fine, thanks.
I did get a really lovely bunch of flowers. About 3 weeks ago off Death, and I think it's because she just picked up. I was really struggling, and I don't normally complain, but I think there's one last thing I wanted to just mention, Rachel, is managers need to remember that just because we are an individual with a health condition doesn't mean to say that our presentation doesn't change, because my difficulties change month to month, from a medication perspective, and for, rejection. For me personally, I lunge, month by month, sometimes quarter by quarter, and my reasonable adjustments need to be, looked at and considered frequently. It's not just a tick, we've done it, just, these adjustments are made. So it's important to remember that this process is absolutely organic and will be for the rest of my, my working life.
And that's everyone's touched on fatigue. And obviously we have a condition called chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. And there's such good information on the websites for chronic fatigue, and also for other conditions, for example, fibromyalgia, etc., where it actually does list what would reasonable adjustments be for that specific condition. And one of the things that I think is so hard for managers to understand, and therefore teams, is this flexible approach to reasonable adjustments. And it's like, oh, well, 2 weeks ago you could do this, well, why can't you do this now? Yeah. Some of that is about rest time at work. So saying, okay, a lunch break of 30 minutes might be okay for me this day, but might not be for the next day. And I think, Carrie, you kind of touched on that with regards to wonderful guide dog. And sometimes it's not just about your needs, but it might be about the needs, of your guide dog as well. So, and how maybe the impact that might have on Amber, but also if you're not feeling too good one day, what impact might that have on her as well? And I don't know if you want to come in there with any comments, but
yeah, I think like with Amber as well, like there was I remember one night she actually got into the bin because she's quite naughty and quite foodie, but then obviously the whole of the next day, because she's trained to go to the toilet at certain times, but then the whole of the next day I knew she had a bad tummy, so I'm then on high alert thinking, oh, because she lets me know when she needs to go, so then the whole of the next day I'm on high alert, because in the back of my head I'm thinking, as soon as I start seeing a patient or anything, I'm like, if she needs to go to the toilet, I need to get her out of the hospital in like 10 minutes down the road, because she'll just have a panic about going on the pavement, bless her. But so, and there's always and there are like factors like that to take into consideration. And we were working when it was the heat wave, and it was really, really hot. And we were up on like the 5th floor, and there's a lot of glass, and I can't remember what the temperature was like, but it was like ridiculous. I think it was like last summer. and she was overheating at work. So I made the decision to leave her at home for a couple of days and navigate the ward with my cane. And it was a nightmare. It was so difficult. But there was no discussion. There was no open forum for discussion about, were me and Amber managing all right with the heat? How was that going for us? And then when I brought my cane in, it was a bit like, oh well, if you can do a couple of days without Amber, then we'll get you on you'll be all right another day. And it wasn't, I didn't want, I wasn't expecting them to recognize that I'd kind of sacrificed, but at the same time, that acknowledgement that actually I had to work extra hard those couple of days, and it did burn me out, and I was really tired. I don't know, it's just, I think from a disability point of view as well, once you do something once and somebody sees you do that, they just assume it's repeatable. And I think that's where we need to sort of change as well, which I think comes into what Cheryl said, is just because you're not seeing us going home and crying about how tired we are, it doesn't mean that we're not. And I think as disabled people, we do a stunning job of hiding it as well, in trying to fit in and be like everybody else, and almost mask it rather than actually just be able to speak openly about it, which I think is
now Raz, I'm going to come to you next for you to be as open as you wish, but one of the things you spoke about in one of the previous podcasts very openly was about sometimes even just getting into work can be so fatiguing some days. And I remember, again, it just touched me when you said some days, you're just in tears before you even get there. But I can't say for a fact, but knowing the type of person that you are, probably by the time you enter the doors of the hospital, no one would even know that. So just as comfortable as you do, maybe talk us through some of that.
Yeah, I think, I've actually got a good example. I came home from work Friday and was rolling to the train station, and one of my caster wheels on my wheelchair just fell off, essentially in the middle of the street. And I hadn't noticed until 10 minutes maybe later, where I'd actually essentially nearly fell off my wheelchair because I tipped. I was managing surprisingly quite well until then. And to be honest with you, I didn't know what to do. I actually called my mum in tears. I didn't know whether I should go back and look for it. I didn't know if it's just, I don't know how long, I don't know where it had gone. I don't know if there's any point me looking for it. My wheelchair is made in Italy. It will take days for a new part to come. And then I was panicking about what about work, and the fact that I think especially with COVID, there are a lot of people off, so there's a additional responsibility for helping cover. And I was getting myself into such a state, and also just how I was going to get home on 3 wheels. And I was crying pretty much in the middle of Victoria Station. And my mum told me to go back, and luckily I actually found the wheel. But again, I nearly tipped off trying to find that, and still there was a missing screw and another part which I don't know its name. And I just think the impact of things like that, which no one had seen that, and I'm very lucky that some customer assistant man at the station was really kind to me and had let all the people at the stations know, both there and where I was getting off as well, and kind of helped me off, got home. And again, then it was also about how I'm going to get this fixed. And so I think there were tears about that on Saturday morning, and how I'm going to get to a bike shop to get it fixed, and then going to Screwfix, not knowing what part I need because I don't know anything about it. So I think there were multiple tears after that. Eventually, I'm quite lucky that it was all fixed. So I'm quite lucky that there was some actually very helpful people just generally, a very helpful sales assistant at Screwfix who was actually looking at my wheelchair but didn't have to do that, and a very helpful bike shop person. But I think when things like this happen, our minds tend to escalate, and again, I think it's about worrying about letting the team down is a big thing for me, because I think I always worry personally that people will think I'm not doing as good of a job than able bodies. That's something which is always in my mind. And so I think due to that, I almost sometimes try and compensate, like I think everyone else was talking about, to almost kind of prove my worth. And I think that can be really exhausting. And I just think other things, like I remember during kind of lockdown the first time, something I really struggled with was actually food availability and managing to get food. I remember there was a couple of things left on the shelf which I wanted, and they were so high up, and by the time I had got a shop assistant, they'd all gone. And small things like that you just don't think about, and the struggles behind the scenes, and then let alone struggles at work. And I think it's just for managers to be mindful of that. And when we are asking for reasonable adjustments, well, for me personally, I'm actually really anxious about it. I don't really like asking for help. As I said previously, I really like to be as independent as possible. And even for me personally, even if I need something, it feels really tough to ask for it, and almost feels like a self-failure. Like it's almost like, well, why haven't I got to the part where I can dress myself really easily in my chair without getting tired? And why am I, like, it's almost like me doubting myself as well. Like, well, why do I get dressed on my bed at home? Like maybe I'm just not doing things well enough. So I think it's just to be mindful of like disabled people also being quite hard on ourselves. And again, some of the struggles that we face outside of work and how that can impact work, and that can play a huge part on my mood as well. And that's just the other thing to mention. There are some days where I've dealt with something and I just almost don't want to speak to anyone. And it's not that I'm trying to be rude or anything like that. That's the last thing I'd want to do. But sometimes I just need time to process what's happened and kind of get over it and then restart. So I think just giving that time as well is really important. But I think having a really open manager can honestly make all the difference. And I'm really lucky at the moment that my line manager is so honestly nice, and I've had experiences where people haven't been that open. I remember being told it was problematic that I was starting half an hour later than the whole team. So I think having someone who's really open and kind, it makes such a difference.
Thank you, Raz. Goodness, I feel so many emotions when I'm just listening to you there. And by the way, I'm not Raz's line manager, just to put it out there, she's speaking about someone else. That I'm just going to read out something someone else sent me, which has just resonated so much with what you've said. So when you live with multiple challenges at work and then you experience a new challenge or an unexpected challenge, then you automatically default to the worst case scenario, because that's often what your experience is. Constantly living in a state where you do that is so mentally exhausting, and it can often mean that I often seem miserable because of that. And I was just like, oh my goodness, can you ever imagine, like Raz, you said there sometimes about you being grumpy, or I can't remember the exact word. I could never ever imagine you ever. You probably think you are, but I can't ever imagine you being like that. But that again was just so heartbreaking to hear that. So that is genuinely how someone feels, and the almost dread when they think of something. And sometimes can be a small challenge, but sometimes can be quite huge, Raz, like you've just said, for sharing your experience. So I am conscious about time. I was like at the beginning, this would probably be like a 45-minute chat, and they never end up like that. I want to really finish on some, we'll talk about the ugly and the bad. Sharon, you've touched on lots of nice experiences that you've had and where you felt supported and inclusive, as have Raz and Carrie. But for the listeners now, this is what people can take away. maybe some of the don'ts when it comes to adjustments, some of the do's as well, some of the enablers, some of the real quick fixes, but long-term plans that managers and colleagues and peers can do. Who wants to kick off? That's quite a big remit.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I won't remember everything. Like I just filters in and filters back out again. But I think probably one of the big things for me is just for people not to ask us why all of the time, and that's something that's really hard. I know we mentioned it earlier. There is some days I can definitely do more, and it's a bit like what Raz was saying there about your mood as well. I am absolutely a chatterbox. I pretty much never shut up, and that actually, it is my genuine personality, but it also masks very often how I feel inside. And on some days, and if I am a little bit more quiet, I would love people to just accept that I'm a bit quieter. But it's like, oh, Cheryl, what's wrong? What's wrong? You know, and if you feel the need to kind of share, you know, what is wrong. I guess coming back to the why, just, you know, if people come in a bit late, don't ask them why they're late necessarily. You know, ask them, you know, I don't know, are you okay? A question that just you feel comfortable asking, or just accept that that's the way things are. I'll give you a quick example. I'm sure I didn't mention this the last time, but I very, very much, without thinking, probably hurt someone's feelings who's got a disability. And, you know, it was never my intention. And I guess as a disabled person, it's important to remember that not everybody says things out of, you know, nastiness. And basically it was a photocopier. My floor had been moved and I did twist my face and I was like, oh, honestly, it's going to take us much longer to go there now. And I mean, I do have bone pain, etc., but actually it's no big deal. But unbeknownst to me, it was a member of the network who has got other bits and bobs going on in his admin stuff and uses the photocopier all of the time. But not only did I complain, other people complained, and then she got wind of that. So it's just to be mindful of, you know, what when things are happening and who you're complaining to, and, you know, just to maybe have private conversations about things and just be mindful of who you could be hurting, because I know people have had conversations about me that I've got wind of. But obviously I had the same sort of thing. I talked about a situation that clearly impacted on somebody else. So just be mindful of what you're saying, who you say it to. And I truly, truly, truly believe that if we could just all be a little bit more kind, then you've got a lot less opportunity to be hurtful. And, you know, it's exactly what you were mentioning before. I do come home and I cry. I am a crier, but I'm also extremely determined. So many people say to me, I'm going to retire at 55. I'm like, I'm going to be working when I'm 70 because I'm here to prove a point. Honestly, I'm like, I refuse to be knocked off my perch because of a disability. When it comes, but I just want to keep going, and I don't want people asking us those like negative questions. I just want to be, you know, positive and just be kind. I think that's honestly the most important thing.
And don't you think, Cheryl, sometimes communication is always that default barrier? So in the situation with the photocopier, if there'd been a communication to go out to say, just to let everyone know the photocopier is being moved
totally
as part of a reasonable adjustment, or whatever language would be acceptable to that individual, then that could have just been quashed. And then, Cheryl, you could have said to the person that sent an email, oh, look, you know, that's great that you've done that, but I might have a reasonable adjustment. And then it's like, do you need 2 photocopiers? Do you know? So is the manager, that would be a reasonable adjustment, wouldn't it, to help
absolutely
both parties, you know, being equitable, in Raz's words, level in the playing field. So I do think as managers, sometimes the communication default or lack of it is often to blame for some of these, like you said, reactions coming from just a very organic place, thinking, oh my God, because that is a reaction to us, because we individualize things, don't we? But actually having it in context and circumstance. Thank you, Cheryl. Does anyone else want to come in at that point? Go on, Carrie.
I was going to say, yeah, along the same lines as Cheryl, really. I think it's that acceptance as well of, you know, not questioning why somebody has got something different, but actually just accepting that if they've got something different, it's because they need it. And I think the mindset that, oh, you know, like, oh, somebody they're getting extra compared to everyone else. I think that just needs to change. Like Cheryl says, to just be kind. And I think from a leadership perspective, like we've said all the way through, really, about having those organic conversations and enabling like the employee with the disability to actually feel safe and empowered enough to actually discuss potential reasonable adjustments or what they would need, or to just have somebody to say, do you know what, I'm really struggling with this, have you got any ideas, and bounce ideas off of one another. We don't expect a straight out bang, that's sorted forevermore. Nobody expects that, but it's about that process of being able to have those conversations and for that to happen. And yeah, so that would be my advice to any sort of manager, would just be to make your employee feel safe enough and empowered enough to be able to have those conversations openly.
So again, that psychologically safe, inclusive space, that's part of the team, where there's just that open communication, transparency, and a safe way to raise these things, as well as sometimes a default, like I think maybe you alluded to, Raz, before, about being made to feel a troublemaker, or like, oh, you know, here we'll go again, or there's something else that's being brought to my attention. So it's more about just genuinely, I suppose, people caring, which sounds really basic, but that's what it is, isn't it? It's about, we're all human, and sometimes in an organisational structure, especially one as big as the NHS, we lose that thought that people are humans and have feelings, and that we need to care for each other and care for people, because we're so busy caring about the patients or the numbers or the data or the targets, forget about the people that deliver all of those. Now, Raz, coming into you, and then if everyone gets prepared, because we're going to have the comment to wrap up, you know, I don't like to finish with the last word. Raz.
So I think for me, I'm going to be maybe slightly harsher than everyone else, but I completely agree with everyone. I think for me, it's just about acting now. Don't just wait until I apply for a job. The Equality Act is anticipatory. So if you are not anticipating at this point, if something happens down the line where someone might take something to court, it's not going to look good. And I just really would advocate for managers to start thinking about this now and start acting now, start thinking ahead, start thinking what would happen if you had a wheelchair user attendant, start thinking about what would happen if someone is visually impaired or hearing impaired or has a chronic illness. I would just say, I think it's really important to start now. There's no better time.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And this is definitely a wider conversation, but it's so hard to do that in NHS structures. And I honestly think, where are like our estates teams in this? Where are the people that look after the building? Like, this act has existed for over 10 years. So it's almost like, why hasn't there been meaningful change? Why don't we have inclusive organisations? And then for middle managers or because the people of managers, the people that manage people are generally middle managers, aren't they? The higher up the food chain you get, the less people you tend to actually manage, and therefore, if I'm being really controversial, care about, because you become very corporate. So that's probably where the default is, Raz, isn't it? The fact that actually the people who do care have very little influence in the organisational structure that exists, and the people that have the positional power to change probably don't then have that lived experience or that desire to make it better, unless it becomes a legal issue, and then there start to be more. Well, that's probably really controversial what I've just said there, but would you say that's an accurate maybe summary?
I think so, but then I know we were discussing previously about kind of managers worrying about the service provision, and I know, Carrie, you were mentioning that as well. And I think things like flexible working times, I know people have reached out to me and said that no, they can't because of their manager has said that their service provision doesn't allow it. So I think there is, to some extent, and I think especially in my situation with a physical disability where there are so many physical barriers, for sure. But I also do think some of those kind of middle managers, like you were saying, do also need to be a bit more understanding and shape up a little bit on understanding the Equality Act and what that means. And on that, I would actually say that if a middle manager is going to reject or decline a reasonable adjustment, I would really get that checked. I don't think it's, because that has an impact potentially on that trust. So it's not just about you, it's about, there's a wider picture here of the fact that this is covered by law. And so I do think for those middle managers, if they are going to decline a reasonable adjustment, I would really advise them to speak to HR and check first.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is where the networks come in as well as the powerful voice. And I know Cheryl probably would agree with that, and drive and influence. But for me, if you're a manager listening and you think, oh God, you know, we'll work 8 till 4, half 8 till half 4, whatever it is with this traditional model, we can't break that. If I give it to one of them, they all want it. It's like, what does it matter? That's what I think as the manager. If I'm enabling someone to be more productive, to be independent, what do I care if they start at 10 o'clock and work till 6? Like, how does it affect me as a manager? My service might be better off for it, because I often think having FaceTimes is a good thing. You've got more cover. Sometimes it's even about offices being emptier or being quieter at the end of the day for people who might be over 42 who suffer with like multiple stimulus. And so actually start thinking a different way, isn't it, Raz? It's about actually, by allowing the reasonable adjustment, sometimes it's not about just the individual, it's about your whole service and the impact it can have. And if COVID has shown us anything, it's the fact that Monday to Friday 9 till 5 is not the most productive, efficient way to run services. And there are other ways to do that, including kind of, you know, virtual ways of doing things, working remotely from home, gone are the days where we have to be physically sat in an office space 5 days a week. So I'm going to come around to everyone individually where you can mention anything at all you want, anything we've missed, any final comments. We're potentially going to talk about leadership, but there's no way we've got even touched about that, so that'll have to be another podcast all in itself. Carrie, coming down to you.
Okay, so yeah, I think like Raz says, definitely like act now, be prepared. And I think with the majority of large organizations, they're always making sure they're ticking those boxes. Like they've always got like, oh, they've got somebody in charge of equality and somebody in charge of diversity and all of that. But actually, when it comes to actually like one of us being recruited or actually working for them, you don't see those people whose names are on the policies, who are underlining it, who are, you know, putting all those policies online and saying that they're all in place to help us, because they're not there. Like the policies are there, but it's not there on the ground. It's not actually happening to actually help us. And I think that's, yeah, I think basically if you're gonna go as an organization, if you're gonna go to the trouble of, you know, putting those policies in place and nominating people to be responsible for that, let's make them accountable for it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. Cheryl.
Yeah, just briefly, obviously you were saying there we haven't got time to talk about leadership, but I think for me, my closing thing would be, in the ideal world, we would have more people with visible disabilities or open and honest about the disabilities and transparency at a higher level. And I'm really passionate about that. And I've been talking to various people, various chief execs from different organizations to try and express that my desire to have that, because actually without that, I think we've got lots of other lots of people from other with protected characteristics from other groups and other networks, you know, who are quite open and visible. But actually, from a disability perspective, I'm not convinced that we've got people in higher leadership who can actually openly say, you know, these are my difficulties, and I get it, I understand, and really embrace the changes that we need. And that's something that I personally really want to push forward. I'd love to think one day I could be part of just making that change and making people think that they can, you know, go a step further and be more than what they are, you know, and get rid of this kind of banding and you know, you undersell yourself, I think, with a disability, because sometimes you're just glad that someone is, you know, accepting you coming to work and doing a day's work. Well, actually, I want to go above and beyond as a clinician, but also, you know, to prove that people with disabilities really should have no barriers, and we need to encourage everybody else who experiences the same difficulties to be behind us and support us with that.
Cheryl, well, honestly, I'll be on your campaign team. I'm telling you now, pet. You need to go for some of these national roles. I know the problem is you love your job too much. That's your problem. You're so dedicated
Well,
to your cause. So, but
COVID has
honestly,
changed things a little bit, Rachel. COVID has changed things.
I tell you, I'll definitely be a great campaign manager. For sure. Hello, Geordie. Oh my goodness. Last but not least, Raz, coming to you.
I think for me, I know I've touched a lot on some of the struggles I've had, but I just want to reiterate, I know I've done this in other podcasts, but just about some of the positives. Putting in those reasonable adjustments makes my life much easier, and it means that I can hopefully build, better rapport with patients rolling in at eye level. I can be just as quick kind of putting on gloves and aprons than everyone else. So I guess it's just to help me be as independent as possible, and that in itself is a really positive thing, and that's why everyone who's listening to this should be advocating to put reasonable adjustments in so that I can be the best that I can be.
Thank you so much, and aren't we so fortunate you've shared this space with us again? And I'm extra lucky having you as part of our team. So a huge thank you to everyone tonight, which is now very late on an evening. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone's enjoyed. Please do feedback, and as the panel have mentioned, if anyone wants to reach out for any support, if you are struggling or you want to just learn a little bit more, please reach out. Connect people. Thank you so much.